I think the other is really this idea that we've been talking about today, which is we are global in a very real on the ground sense, right? We have investment partners like myself, but not just myself, that have been based in the regions in which they now invest for years or decades. And I think what that enables us to do when it comes to supporting our founders is, well, first of all, we can conduct better diligence and see opportunities that others don't see. But the other idea is that when it comes to BD partnerships, go to market, let's say you need help in Asia, I would argue we are one of the best players to help you with that.
Welcome back to the BlockFuel podcast. I'm here with Augie Ilag from CMT Digital. Augie, we just caught up for about 5 to 10 minutes, just quickly getting to know each other, and did some research, of course, on you prior to you joining CMT and jumping on this call. Welcome to BlockFuel, first and foremost.
No, thanks so much for having me. I've been a huge fan of the podcast. Love your guys' content, so excited to be here for sure.
Love the casual shout out there. I appreciate it. But so you have a pretty diverse career. On paper, you look phenomenal. I'd hire you. You had McKinsey, you were at Sequoia, and now CMT Digital. You did a few other short stints, but I think those three I kind of picked out for understanding your background in consulting, traditional VC. How is that approach coming from well-known Sequoia? They have quite the portfolio. I actually worked for 2 companies that were Sequoia back in the day. In terms of coming from that traditional consulting background and VC to talking about CMT Digital, how has that kind of shaped your approach looking at new companies and kind of looking at the future?
Yeah, for sure. No, it's a good question. And maybe I can first paint for you a little bit kind of all these pieces fit together, because mixed in there was this move to Asia. And I know it's not exactly a straightforward story, but I'll try to tell you to it.
Yeah.
I'll try to tell it to you. So I'm originally from Chicago, born and raised. Grew up in the suburbs, went to school at Stanford for undergrad and master's, but I am heritage-wise Filipino and Mexican. My mom is Mexican, my dad is Filipino. And I think with a lot of mixed kids, at least has been my experience, you grow up more on the mom side. So like culture, language, food, everything. I was much more Mexican growing up. And what that meant was, as an angsty master's student graduate from Stanford, I, for whatever reason, decided to prioritize spending time and living in the Philippines. And so that's basically what I did. In 2014, I shipped out to Manila, spent about 4 years there working for McKinsey. And that was really like my crash course in understanding how business was done in Asia, right? Like I'd obviously visited quite extensively in the past, but that was vacation, these sorts of things. And so understanding more the cultural nuances, the opportunity set in Asia, I would say McKinsey was quite fundamental there for me. I was working with clients basically in places like Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, of course. So I think that has very much shaped how I view the region and just in general how to do business. From there, as you mentioned, I moved over to the early stage venture side of things, specifically with Sequoia Capital based in Singapore. I was actually the first analyst on the seed team in Southeast Asia. And so got to see kind of the other end of the spectrum, right? At McKinsey, I was working with scaled businesses. Here I'm working with basically just a couple founders, a pitch deck and a dream. And yeah, I guess the crypto part of this whole thing kind of came in fairly recently. It was probably 2020, 2021, when I was covering the Philippine market across all sectors for Sequoia, when my partners came to me and said, hey, there's this crypto stuff happening. Most of it's happening in Southeast Asia and actually in the Philippines specifically. Can you go look at this Axie Infinity and YGG and explain to us what is going on here? And I said, sure, like I don't really know what's going on either, but I will try to figure it out. And so that was really how I got my feet wet and how I got exposed more from a consumer slash NFT gaming point of view. But by the time I left the firm, I was leading all of our work in crypto in Southeast Asia. So that has been my experience. I joined CMT about 18 months ago, and my role on the team is I'm one of the investment partners that helps to deploy the fund. And I also look after our business in Asia. So that's kind of been my story. And I guess to finally get back to your question, Avi, I think on the consulting side of things, really helping to me understand what business in Asia is like. And I'm happy to kind of get into more specifics there later, obviously. I think what Sequoia instilled in me really is this quote unquote venture toolkit, right? Where I think one of the problems with venture, crypto or traditional is the feedback cycle is so long, right? Like we make investments now, we do some diligence, but we don't know if sort of those decisions were good or bad until many years from now when the companies are successful or not. And even then, it might be successful, but it was a
Mm.
wrong decision at the offset, or it was a right decision, but the company was still not successful. Very path dependent venture, right? And so what then do you do? How do you learn? How do you get better? Well, my view on that
Mm.
topic is really you need to study the organizations that have demonstrated sound investment judgment over the course of decades, places like Sequoia that have basically developed these frameworks and best practices in terms of what matters and what to look for. And so that venture toolkit is one thing that I've
Mm.
taken with me to CMT, if that makes sense.
I want to double tap into the move to Asia. You were talking about like the culture. There's a book I bought, have not read it. It's sitting in my shelf, but Kiss, Bow, Shake Hands. And so it talks kind of about the different cultures. And I've heard stories, friend, his father was overseas and they were literally in Japan writing on a napkin. And there was like 10 guys in a suit that left the table and then would come back. And he was bewildered in terms of what could happen next. And so I don't know if it literally felt like I was reading out a Shoe Dog, the founder of Nike's
Sure.
book, Phil Knight. And it was just like, does that actually happen? And he gave me an example of it happening. Maybe things have shifted over time, but any stories you could share of your first foray into going out east? And do you think some being mixed and having family from that area come as an advantage, and do people understand your culture better? And yeah, any kind of like tips even for BD folks that are in the US and trying to tackle the Asian markets?
It's a really interesting question. And for sure, when I first came, I mean, despite like some of the cultural affinity, I thought it would be easier. I think there was still quite a lot of ramping up that I had to do. And just like I said, faux pas that I made despite that background. Like I think to go with your last question first, like I really think that actually one of the best things you could do, and this advice was given to me even like 8, 9 years here in the region, is I guess set expectations properly, right? Which is basically tell these people and make sure that they're quite aware that you are a foreigner, you're American, or you're whatever. I think that helps to manage and temper their expectations. Like one of the, I think, best and most helpful pieces of advice that I heard when I first came to the region was you can try all you want to learn the cultural nuances. You can try to get to that same level that you're describing, which is in Japanese culture, for example, there's a specific place you want to sit as the guest versus the host. Even when you're in a taxi, there's like a hierarchy of seats in the taxi. If you're with a client, some seats you never take. You always want to give that to the person that you're looking up to or that you're trying to show respect to. But rather than kind of go through all that, because you'll still never be perfect, obviously, it's actually much more helpful to make it clear at the offset that I'm doing my best to respect your culture. Maybe you do the small things that really matter, that indicate that, hey, I'm making an effort here. But at the same time, you say that you establish the fact that you are from a different culture, and then you're granted a little bit more leeway. They're a little bit more lax with you. I think that is really, really important, because otherwise you try to match them at their game, which is I'm going to really get into this thing. Well, they're going to nitpick it then, obviously, right? And then it's a little bit more challenging for
Yeah.
you as a foreigner. I think that's like one thing that I found quite helpful.
Yeah, no, that's funny. So CMT, just like your investment, is particularly on like early stage investments in the blockchain space, obviously. So compared to like a 10T Ventures and some of the folks that will look for companies that have years of experience and have revenue, and they don't maybe get the early stage upside necessarily. What are some of like the critical factors you consider early on when a company is maybe pre-revenue? A lot in the space are, right, or even trying to find a way to make revenue and understanding that. So what are some of like those critical factors? How do you assess some of the long-term viability of a project on such a nascent industry?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, to start, I think we try to generally keep things pretty simple here at CMT, by which I mean our general mindset when it comes to early stage investing is we're operating in a world where there are many, many unknowns, right? Many questions that you could potentially ask of a business. What is the business model? What is the market size? What is the founder background? What is the go-to-market strategy? And what are the risk factors? And you can, I think, drive yourself crazy going in circles. You can always find a reason not to invest, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so I think part of our job is, first, we're always starting with our thesis, right? What is the world that we envision in the blockchain space? And then we work backwards from there to try to find founders and opportunities that fit that vision. From there, like I said, we try to keep them simple, which is every stage, whether it's a seed, let's say Series A or a growth stage opportunity, we have what we call a spec or a specification. What are the things that actually matter for that stage? And we try to get very, very good at assessing those things. So for example, at seed stage, our spec for a blockchain company is they need to have an outlier founding team. They need to have a market with very positive dynamics or tailwinds, and you need to have some sort of compelling value proposition and unique insight. If you have those things, in our mind, this is an opportunity that's worth underwriting, assuming that the valuation is roughly within some guardrails. Similarly, we have a spec for
Mm-hmm.
venture and we have a spec for growth. And so I think that is the first thing we try to do, which is distill what matters versus things we can live without. But then obviously we have to try to figure out how to first of all, what do those things actually mean? Outlier team, that's all fine and dandy to say. What does an outlier team look like? What characteristics do they have? What attributes do they demonstrate? And then finally, how do we assess those things? So that is really the work to be done. But I guess the point I wanted to make is we try to generally keep things simple. We start with a thesis, we work backwards. We then figure out what are the 2, 3 things most important to find. And we try to get very, very good at
Mm-hmm.
assessing those things.
Can you talk a little bit further about, like, you always hear from VCs, they invest in the founder first and then look at the business. You guys have a broader spectrum there, but in terms of like some of the unique attributes of these individuals, of the founders, like, is there any tips you can share in kind of what CMT looks at as someone that is an outlier, I guess?
Yeah, it's a good question. And for we do try to obviously continue to refine this over time based on new data points that come in. But I guess the direct answer to
Mm-hmm.
your question is I think there's a few things in our mind that make up an outlier team. First is this concept of founder market fit, to use more jargon. Founder market fit, what does that mean? It basically means that this founding team is the best to build this particular product that they're building. And I think that is a combination of course, domain expertise. Ideally, they would have done something similar in the past in an adjacent industry that confers some ability to build this business. It also, I think, is
Mm-hmm.
comprised of founder motivation, right? That is something that we very carefully try to assess, which is what is the reason that you're building this business? Because in my mind, there's almost a hierarchy of founder motivations. And the reason that this is important, if I take a step back, is the founder journey, the startup journey is difficult and it's a long one. And I think when the going
Mm-hmm.
gets tough, as it inevitably does, it's really the founder motivation that ultimately this person has to decide whether they will go the distance, whether they will call it and say, listen, I'm just going to close up shop and do something else that isn't taking up 18 hours of my day, or I'm going to keep pushing and make
Mm-hmm.
something happen here. That's the founder. That's why founder motivation is important. And that's why I think, let's say you were an executive operating in an industry, you were personally afflicted by a problem, and then you started a business to go and solve it. That is an incredibly powerful founder motivation, right? It's almost,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I hear these pitches where founders are just straight up angry. You can tell how passionate they are about solving this problem. That is kind of the thing that we look for. So founder market fit, I think those are broadly the components. Beyond that, maybe one other thing
Mm-hmm.
that I like to look for is storytelling ability. And the reason that I think that's important, and actually there's a quote or a video you can find online from Mike Moritz, who's one of the original GPs of Sequoia, talking about this, which is storytelling is an important capability for seed stage founders, simply because in the early days, there's really nothing else besides the story, right? It's basically
Right.
the team, the deck, and what you're out there trying to do is convince everybody via story that this is something worth getting involved in, right? You have to convince investors that hey,
Mm-hmm.
this is worth backing. You have to convince other co-founders and other employees that it's worth joining you on this enterprise when really there's nothing there except for smoke and mirrors. And you have to convince your customers,
Mm-hmm.
right? Maybe buy this product when I don't even have anything built yet. And so storytelling, I would say, is one other facet among many others that we think comprises or makes up an outlier founding team.
Yeah, no, I love it, and especially in a space where it's a lot of engineer founders. I think that is something sometimes more difficult for engineers to be a little more outgoing and being able to articulate the story. They may have all the brains in the background, but then sometimes it's those really unicorn folks that can kind of do both.
And
I
and
always love sales engineers for that reason. They
and
can kind
for
of talk
sure.
tech as well.
And it's not to say obviously this all needs to be in one person. I think that's obviously where the kind of multiple folks on the team comes in. I mean, bringing it back to our industry, I think this was very successfully done in my mind with Eigenlayer, right? Sriram, but they also have,
Mm-hmm.
and Sriram is all very, very well spoken. Maybe that's not the best example, but they also have Calvin, who I think brings a very complementary skill set to the table in that whole equation.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and I love. We talked with Barachain, I think like 2-3 weeks ago, and they always have these big parties. I didn't know too much about it, candidly, before I was speaking, and I had heard it was like vaporware. I'd heard it was like the best thing ever, and talking with Smokey, I was pretty actually impressed with his background and some of the storytelling he was explaining behind why they built it and how they built it. One quick question before we switch gears on that too. We had Odai over from Elements last week, and he was talking about how he went through 150 pitches before someone said yes,
Mm.
and then they all started to pile on. So what is it about, like, have you ever had an investment where it's like right away that they're going to be a hit, or is it typically take someone knocking in your door a few times? And I guess any other tips for entrepreneurs out there that like Odai, who reached out to 150 before someone said yes, to like keep them going at knock number 149 basically.
Yeah, it's a tough question. So I guess on the first one, for sure, I've come out of pitches, 30-minute conversations with folks, and I'm just blown away either by the founders' insights on the industry, the differentiated approach that they're taking. There are for sure instances where I come out, and that's really why I'm in this industry, why I'm in this role that I'm in, is for those types of meetings, right? It feels like a high sometimes just be able to speak to these people and just have them open the kimono, these experts in their field, to just explain to you, this is the future that I envision. It's really exciting, right? And so those pitches happen for sure. I would say they're relatively far and few between, and it's also not always signal, right? I mean, it's a long journey, as you and I have been discussing, and I think many of the hottest companies, maybe you invest, super competitive deal, very exciting. They aren't necessarily the ones that will stand the test of time, and the ones that you didn't think were going to work out really well end up being your biggest success stories. And so that is just a little bit the nature of venture. And so while I do come out of pitches very excited very often, I think that's something to just keep in mind, is that the journey is long. And like I said, the dogs of today could become the success stories of tomorrow, and vice versa. In terms of advice for founders, yeah, I mean, especially in today's market environment, it's definitely quite challenging to fundraise. And so I do think that a few small pieces of advice might be: one, just narrowly focusing in on who you think in particular amongst a sea of investors out there, who is the best choice for EULA, because there's obviously differences amongst VCs and even investment professionals within those VCs, depending on their sector of focus, their geographic coverage, their specific theses, the stage that they play at. And so I think narrowing in on that is the first thing that you can do to try to increase your chances of success. The other is the point that you mentioned, Avi, which is it is a little bit, FOMO is a major factor here, right? And so I think the second that you get one yes, that is super helpful in getting subsequent yeses, even if it's a very high profile angel or angels, right? That has been used to great effect to kind of get the ball rolling in the fundraising process. Maybe a foundation that gave you a grant, right? Like that is some signal that I think can get the ball rolling and get other people excited, at least to get your foot in the door in some of those early conversations.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And especially I mean, every single industry has market cycles, right? I don't think there is a bigger industry affected by market cycles than crypto. And I've been in the space since 2017. I have friends that have been in the space. I think 2012 is probably my earliest. I'm sure people 2010 or Satoshi himself. But in terms of looking at your investments, right? And you're saying timing is kind of everything when it comes to investments. How do you guys look at some of these market cycles? And are you guys trying to invest when you guys can get the best deal from a business perspective? I think that would make sense. And I guess, like, how do you guys look at that? And you can't really time the market, but especially with the US and their policies and being such a global industry, every section of the world has their own laws right now and kind of red tape that you have to go through. So how do you guys, two parts to this, I guess, the market cycles, and then how are you guys looking at some of the policies that are coming out, and how can you almost predict or make educated guesses 6 months, 12 months out?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I guess to start with sort of our general investment philosophy, we are generally investing in companies for the long run, like let's say a 5 to 10 year time horizon. And so what that generally means is, while we are very cognizant of market cycles, it doesn't necessarily affect the whole strategy, right? In terms of categories that we focus on, general portfolio strategy, like a lot of that doesn't change whether it's bull or bear. I think where it does play a critical role is on two topics, which is pace of deployment, and also divestments, right? So on the pace side of things, I think it's the Warren Buffett quote, right? Like, be greedy when others are fearful, and be fearful when others are greedy.
Yep.
Like, I think it has definitely been my experience that some of the best investments are made in frankly periods like this one. Sideways market, super choppy, a lot of uncertainty, and yet we are seeing a lot of builders come out of the woodwork, and these opportunities tend to be fairly priced just because of that aforementioned uncertainty in the macro environment.
Mhm.
On the divestment side of things, I think one of the things that crypto investors in particular have to deal with, which early stage traditional venture investors do not, or have to do to a lesser extent, is we are dealing with basically public and private market decisions all at once, right? There's TGE very early,
Mhm.
typically in the lifespan of a company. And so you're left with these liquid tokens and you have to make a decision on what to do with those. And I think that's not an easy thing for a venture investor to do. I mean, you can imagine, right? Like our general philosophy and training is long-term, swinging for the fences and holding on into a liquidity event like IPO. That's generally the venture mindset.
Mhm.
But in crypto, it's not like that, right? And so how do you do it, right? Well, I think that's one area that CMT really shines, which is the best answer to that question, right? How do you embed best practices from public markets and private markets? Well, I think it's just having a diverse team where you have those capabilities, right? And at
Mhm.
CMT, we have the benefit of having traders, folks that can employ more of a trader mindset and public market mindset. And then, of course, we have more classically trained venture professionals
Mhm.
like myself. And I think all of that together enables better decision making. And so I would say those are the two areas that primarily affect or change in market cycles, but generally we try to take more of
Mhm.
a long-term view.
I know I was saying we don't really love to talk about meme coins, but I do think it's been quite the phenomenon, especially on Solana. A few months back, everyone was kind of day trading these meme coins, and they are fun. I joke that I don't love them, but I've done them, and they are fun to play around with. But I always said there are some like pieces of learnings there, and in terms of like how much money some of these meme coins can raise so quickly. I guess has there been any like conversation amongst VCs? I know that some VCs play around with them themselves, but more so from like the macro perspective of how they're able to like raise money. And it's not necessarily like a republic where it's not exactly like that, but in terms of like raising capital, have VCs been talking about like taking some of the learnings from meme coins in a sense on how they're able to like get everyone involved or like raise money from outside investors, I guess?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And for sure, we don't directly invest in meme coins, but we have been studying the space quite actively and trying to understand what it means kind of for broader crypto. And I would say the two areas for us that we think about a lot is one is actually this whole idea. I'm sure you would have seen, I think it was last quarter on crypto Twitter, this whole idea of why are meme coins popular? And I think a lot of the conversation there was this idea of financial nihilism, right? This idea that in the
Mm.
US, I guess a lot of young Americans, especially men perhaps, feel left behind and feel that their station in life is a poor one and there's no way around that. There's no way to escape that. There's no way to change your circumstance. And therefore, they look towards speculation or assets like
Mm.
meme coin to try to turn that around. That actually, funny enough, if you look at Asia, is something like when I first read that, I was like, this has been in Asia pretty much forever, right? Just a recent trend in the US. But
Mm.
this whole idea that speculation and more broadly crypto might receive good reception because people are using it as a way to change their circumstance in life. I mean, that is the story of why crypto is so popular in places like Vietnam and Korea, right?
Mm.
In Korea, for example, the reason, in my estimation, that crypto has received such fierce adoption on the retail side is because young people fundamentally believe, true or not, that if they don't get into one of the top three schools, they don't work at the top five conglomerates, Samsung,
Mm.
etc., they are destined for a mediocre life. Like I said, true or not, that is how young people at least have expressed to me. And I think what that means is there's an opportunity for these types of solutions, not just meme coins, but I think prediction markets. I think anything related to
Yeah.
speculation could play very well with an Asian audience for those reasons. So I think that is for me one of the learnings. The other, frankly, is a little bit this pushback against what has traditionally been the VC playbook. And I say sort of the VC playbook. This is not our investment approach, but I think one of the things that we've seen in the last cycle is you pick a category that's well trodden and well proven, like let's say perp dex or a layer one or layer two. I invest in those things. I put the centralized exchange, and then I do it again. I think that is a story and an approach. Like I said, not everyone takes it, but it's a playbook that's rapidly falling out of favor. And the reason it's falling out of favor is
Mm.
retail investors are basically saying, I don't want to back these VC coins anymore. I want to do something that appears more fair, like a meme coin. And I think the other player that's
Mm.
involved here and is acting like a good actor in this instance is the exchanges, right? The exchanges are basically putting their foot down and saying, we are not going to list this high FTV, low float stuff anymore because it's to the detriment of us and our users.
Yeah.
And yeah, those for us have been two of the things we've been thinking about.
Yeah. No, you didn't mention Polymarket directly, but that's a pretty popular one for the prediction markets. And I find it fascinating because you look at the polls for the president, you can't walk down the street without someone talking about Harris or Trump at this point.
Mm.
And in the polls right now, Harris is actually leading by like 3 to 4 points. But on Polymarket, I just took a look just now, Trump's up by 3 points. And then there's rumors today, by the time this comes out, this may be old news, but RFK is going to be in Arizona at the same time that Trump is. And there's talks about him joining Trump. And both of those two were at Bitcoin Nashville, right? And they've been, I guess, more pro crypto. Are you guys talking about this in VCs? Are you guys taking a look or making predictions yourself of like what impact obviously that would have on the markets in general, and more specifically with crypto, with them being more pro crypto, if that's been on the radar? I know I don't want to ask you who you're voting for, but just in general, the conversations that may have been happening so far.
Yeah, no, for sure. To be honest, I'm not the right person to ask. It's been 10 years outside the US, so I'm probably not the most informed on this topic. I
Right.
would say as a firm, we are obviously very much in favor of just more regulatory clarity in general, whatever party
Yep.
that pushes that. But for prediction markets, like I do think it's really interesting, right? Like I just wanted to touch on that briefly, Avi, just because we've backed
Yeah.
a few prediction markets. I myself sponsored an investment in an India-based prediction market called Griffy. And I think it's just fascinating, right? Like very clearly, folks like Polymarkets have achieved some early product market fit. And it's one of those ideas where the value proposition of crypto just makes sense, right? Like that's where, in my mind, the
Mhm.
mantra "put your money where your mouth is"
Exactly.
comes from, right? It's the idea that like if I
Mhm.
come and knock on your door and I ask you a question, there's any myriad of reasons that you might tell me something different beyond what you truly feel. But when there's money involved, when you put
Mhm.
something at stake, then you actually display your beliefs on your sleeve. And so I think prediction
Yep.
markets is one of many examples of ideas that have been around in crypto for a very long time, but we're a little early, right? Both from an infrastructure
Mhm.
perspective, but also from an adoption perspective. And so that is one area that we're also on the lookout for, which is what are things that just have always made sense, but only today make sense to be built, like a prediction market.
Do you think some of this institutional interest, I guess, is caused by some of the clarity that's happening with the regulations, or is it just overwhelming? More and more people are in crypto and knocking on the doors, and now they have a voice at the voting booth for the first time. It feels like that they're paying attention to us now. So, what do you think could be like the main driving force behind this institutional adoption?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we are obviously seeing what you're seeing, Avi, just immense
Mm.
institutional demand. I mean, look at the Bitcoin ETF, which was by far and away the most successful ETF of all time, bar none. And so I guess in my mind and from our perspective, I think part of it is just this technology is inevitable and is buttressed by bottom-up adoption, right? There was a Coinbase article that they put out a few months ago that basically talked about how over 50 million Americans view own this technology, 20% of the population. And there's another poll I think that DCG put out that said basically crypto is a key issue for, let's say, 20%, around 20% of battleground state voters, right? So I think part of it is that it's just this grassroots adoption and demand, and people are now making their opinions heard at the voting booth, and that influences policy. So yeah, I think we see it just like you see it, Avi, which is you've seen this kind of about face from some of Bitcoin's harshest critics. Larry Fink, I think, famously called it a pet rock in 2017. He's now saying that every
Yeah.
asset will now be tokenized. And so all of that is generally very positive. I think the work that we're trying to do now as venture investors is understand now that the ETFs are out, Bitcoin, ETH, as you said, maybe some others in the future. By the way, this is also the case in other markets. Hong Kong was the first in Asia to launch both the Bitcoin and the ETH ETFs. But what's next, right? What's
Yeah.
next in terms of investable
Mm.
opportunities and startups that might be created? And so we're spending time thinking about both on the retail and on the institution side, both products and maybe infrastructure. If we think institutional adoption is kind of the next wave, what are some of the new startups that need to be built to support that new demand?
Yeah. And you kind of just touched on it too, but with like RWA, I know that's been a big conversation. Some people laugh at it because it's just like that is just like real world adoption in a sense. And our friends over at RWA World are kind of front running permissionless with RWA Day, where they're bringing in a lot of folks from the institutions that are interested in investing in the space. And we're super excited about that. We'll be media partners there as well as in Token 2049, as we mentioned. But in terms of like the RWA space, I was just listening to a podcast. I think it was the founder of, now I'm blanking on the name, but they were talking about how RWA is going to be in the next 1 to 3 years be larger than the market cap of all of crypto, right? Do you also believe that, number one? And then I guess like what's your overall take in the space, kind of talking about where else can we invest? If we don't want to go to Bitcoin, can we invest in a new violin? Can we invest in oil tankers? Like, so some of the conversations we're having are around that. Are you seeing this in Asia as well, that RWA is kind of this massive topic that's happening?
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely we are seeing some spurts of innovation in RWA in Asia as well. There's kind of the full gambit from your local tokenized T-bill players, just like Ondo and some of the folks that you see in the US, but for sort of Asia
Yep.
versions that abide by local regulations and local go-to-market strategies. So all of that exists. And I do think we as a firm are very much optimistic on real world assets overall. In our portfolio, for example, we've backed Figure Markets, which is founded by Mike Cagney, and they started off in the real world asset tokenization space. They're now trying to build Figure Markets, which is a exchange for everything. And I think the one lesson that Mike has instilled in us is this idea that it's not blockchain in and of itself that creates liquidity. It's not just tokenizing something that will open up a market for something. You really need market making and ubiquity, right? That's what makes a market.
Yep.
And so I think that's the one question I have for the whole category, which is if we can tokenize everything, if every real world asset can be put on chain, which actually will there be demand for? I think that is the important question that we also try to answer. But we are very bullish on the space. Actually, financial services more broadly, I think is super interesting. Real world asset tokenization, institutional grade DeFi, even pure play retail DeFi. I've seen a little bit of a resurgence and renaissance there where, like I said, as recently as 12 to 18 months ago, it was a lot of copy pasta. But I think we backed Athena at the seed round. We participated in EtherFi's previous round. And so we're super excited about these primitives, ones that really take advantage of the composability of crypto and build something net new, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, totally. I mean, it's fascinating. I think part of that will happen just like by pure like business Darwinism, right? And there's just going to be supply and demand or what people care about and investing in. So like the violin example, maybe people don't care as much and there's not enough liquidity for that to be a viable market. But I think investing in homes and some of these oil and different areas are very exciting to me, where especially for in this world where you're talking about some of that financial nihilism, it's where people can like find that alpha on their own and be able to make those predictions or make those guesses based off everything that's happening in the world and ultimately have a successful investment from it. So fascinating.
Oh, for sure.
What, I don't know if you can, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to add one point. I
don't know if
mean,
you had more.
as you're chatting, you're helping me think a little bit more because you're right. I think one of the things that could be a very interesting opportunity in the Asia context, you were asking about Asia earlier, is this idea of the capital markets generally in a lot of these emerging economies are not very robust. By which I mean, if you're let's say a consumer in Indonesia, you want to buy equities, there's actually very few investable opportunities in your local stock market, maybe 20 at best. And so there's a lot of pent up demand for US equities in a lot of these markets. And so crypto, synthetic, real world asset tokenization, whatever you want to call it, but accessing US based equities as an Indonesian consumer, I think that is an idea that has a lot of promise. It's obviously regulatory arbitrage, but I think accessing, let's say, US markets from abroad for consumers that can't do it in the traditional means, that is one interesting opportunity.
You mentioned Figure. We actually just had them on, and one of our co-founders had worked there for a little bit, Sean Ristow. And so I know he couldn't make it. His sister's wedding is this weekend. So he was asking if we could change this interview. And I said, no, we can't do it the day of, but I'm sure we'll have him on the next time we chat. But in terms of some of those other investments, I know you can't play favorites as a parent to all these companies, but are there a few that you maybe recently invested in that you're pretty excited about that you're open to sharing?
Yeah, for sure. And as you said, the very important caveat and disclaimer is we're obviously super bullish on all of our investments. I'll share with you maybe a few of the Asian ones.
You love all your children.
For sure, all equally. But in Asia, maybe I can give you a few examples of things that we've done recently. So there, one actually, and I'll start with maybe just the general trend, and then I'll give you the opportunity if that works. But one category we're immensely excited about in Asia is consumer, right? And by which I mean consumer applications, gaming, content, IP, this broad category. And the reason we're excited is, I think, one, that is traditionally what Asian developers have done best. If you think about maybe your favorite or the most well-known apps from Asia today, they tend to be consumer apps, right? WeChat, Binance, TikTok, for example. And so I think the talent is there. I also think that Asia, and in particular East Asia, has a lot of natural content to be exported that is only today reaching fever pitch in terms of global demand, right? Anime comes to mind, as does maybe K-pop from Korea. And so we're super excited about blockchain technology and how it interacts with this space. And one company that we backed in this category is a company called Kasagi Labo. What Kasagi Labo does is basically they are a global licensing company. They work with anime studios and help them license their IP across the world for merchandising, content, gaming, etc. And the crypto part here is, in the short run, they're basically helping these companies, these studios, launch digital collectibles for their fan bases. And in the long run, the idea is to put some of this IP on chain to help with coordination between the various stakeholders. So licensing and relicensing becomes that much more easier. They've been doing really well. They're actually just in the process of closing the next fundraise. So that's one example of sort of this East Asian content that I think we're very excited about. I think beyond that, we've been spending a lot of time on Ton. And here I can't really share with you any examples because they're all pretty new. But I would say the Telegram ecosystem for us is very fascinating, right? I mean, I'm sure you would be familiar with the thesis. Maybe for the listeners, this idea, almost this perfect confluence of, you take what is the largest consumer app outside of the US and China, bar none. You put in a founder who is, yes, a little bit eccentric, but has also demonstrated a very strong desire to expose his user base to crypto products, and a very clear but arm's length relationship with a specific chain, which is Ton. I think all of that together is a very interesting opportunity for mass adoption and exposing crypto apps to a very large user base. That can happen in an imported way, where maybe some of these projects, frankly, I think every project will need to have a go-to-market strategy for Telegram. But it also is homegrown, where you see things like Notcoin taking off, and now some of these tapping games like Cadisons. We have one in our portfolio called Gems. So I think Telegram is another very key area of interest for us, and plays along that consumer theme.
Yeah, we just brought on Mythical Games last week, and I actually worked in a company called Arcadium for about 9 months. It was my first company here in New York City. And then early on during COVID, I was investing in a ton of equities, and C Limited was one that we dove really deep into. And now it's not as hot as it once was, or even close, but it was flying during COVID because of Free Fire. So Garena's like their gaming business, and they had this, looked it up, it's 5.4 million concurrent viewers watching that. So that's like literally the Super Bowl of gaming. And if you can get that many people around a game, and I always say, and I'm sure you have some beliefs there too, where it's like, we're going to get to a place where you're not realizing you're using a blockchain game. It just happens to be there, and it's kind of hidden behind the scenes. And I think that's where you truly will reach like ubiquity amongst consumers, and having them starting to use the technology. Same thing with Venmo. I give that example all the time. I don't think about the technology when I send $1 to a friend, or when I'm on the internet, I'm not like looking at the URL even, or like what it's built on, right? And so I think we'll get there eventually. And gaming is quite interesting. That also had like a huge cycle again during COVID. But do you see trends beyond just the bump from COVID, just overall within gaming, that it's increasing over time as more and more people, and not to get too meta here, but like thinking about how AI is going to realistically take some jobs. You see it today at McDonald's, where you used to have someone come take your order. That's dissipating over time, and you're seeing more of those touch screens that come in. So as jobs start to fall off a little bit over time, and as more people have more time on their hands, do you see gaming, is that like a big catalyst for why the gaming industry is starting to continue to grow?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I can share with you my view, which is, and last I checked the numbers, just in terms of overall revenue generated from, let's say, the mobile gaming category. For sure, there was what you described, which is during COVID, when we had nothing else to do, gaming spend skyrocketed. But there was a little bit of a dip, I think, post-COVID, as folks entered the real world once again, and then it kind of steadied somewhere in the middle. And so I think that a few tailwinds for gaming, and in particular in Asia. One is in China, actually, there's been a fairly recent development, last 1-2 years, where basically the government took gaming as like a key area of focus, and they made it much more difficult for you as a developer to launch a new game. You basically needed some new licensing, etc. And what that basically resulted in is actually a lot of traditional gaming talent moving into the Web3 space, leaving China and moving into the Web3 space. And so one of the things that we're very excited about is now this very strong traditional gaming talent in Asia from places like China, Korea, Vietnam, starting to build games that in categories that they're familiar with that are actually fun, right? So I think that is one very, very exciting trend, and I think it's positive for the Web3 gaming space.
So Augie, we're coming up on time, but I do want to like really double down on what makes CMT Digital different from other VCs. And if I'm a founder, like you said earlier, it is a marriage on both sides. You as a founder want to make sure you're going to the right VC that could be strategic and not just silent money on the sidelines, right? So would love to give you a chance to almost pitch CMT Digital to any founders looking for a partner of what really makes you guys different overall from other VCs in the space.
Yeah, for sure. I talked about storytelling. Let's see if I can do it myself. But maybe two things that I would offer you, and two things that make us different, and two things that I hope we're known for in the market, and founders will think about us when they think about CMT. First is this idea that our heritage is trading, right? We are at the core a trading-oriented investment firm, and I think what that means when it comes to our ability to support founders is that we have folks in-house that can assist on topics related to capital markets, market making, tokenomics. And so that capability, that skill set is something that we're very well known for. And it's one area that we can support founders on. I think the other is really this idea that we've been talking about today, which is we are global in a very real on the ground sense, right? We have investment partners like myself, but not just myself, that have been based in the regions in which they now invest for years or decades. And I think what that enables us to do when it comes to supporting our founders is, well, first of all, we can conduct better diligence and see opportunities that others don't see. But the other idea is that when it comes to BD partnerships, go to market, let's say you need help in Asia, I would argue we are one of the best players to help you with that. And so those are two things that I would offer up, but we actually are in the market to raise our next fund. So we'll see to what extent that storytelling resonates.
I love it. Well, thanks so much for popping on. I hope I can make it out to Token 2049. Jody 100% will be out there, so I'll have to connect you guys. But thanks so much for coming on, and I hope to bring you back in a couple months and see what's going on.
No, it was a pleasure, man. Thanks for having me. And yeah, please do hit me up anytime you're in my neck of the woods out here in Asia.